as the sort of theme of debunking goes on, if I can convey two things to you today. The first is that it's no longer really a paradigm of the U.S. sort of transmitting to China what to do on the environment or demanding things from China, which has been, or pressuring of China. It's much more mutual than it used to be, and I want to talk about how. And the second is that actually things are getting better on the environment in China, and there seems to be quite a lag in terms of awareness on that in China. I mean, in the US, and to some extent in China as well. I think traditionally the US-China relationship on environment has been very much a north to south model. While we refer back to the 3 communiques and everything's supposed to be mutual benefit, a great deal of what US-China environmental cooperation has traditionally been is about simply transmitting US expertise on environment to China. The US's other major goal over the last 2 decades is to get China on board for various global issues, and there's been a perception that that's all about pressuring China to comport with international norms. I think that's changed. It's changed over the last decade, but I think it's taken us a while to realize how much that has changed. In the past, I mean, things that we have worked really hard from the US point of view to give expertise to China on have included things like a 20-year effort by US EPA to work with the Chinese on air quality improvements, lots of energy cooperation, a lot of work, especially in the nonprofit and private sector, on biodiversity protection, protected areas, things like that. That's all been of tremendous use, but I think there's really a changing picture now of what's going on in China. So let me show you a little bit of data on air quality. The maps that I'm showing you are from Greenpeace because they've actually produced some images that are a little bit more user-friendly than the ones in the academic literature. But I could have shown you nice graphs from Krotkov et al., which is about 20 NASA scientists who've done the same thing with the NASA satellite data. But if you look at the map on the left, no, it's on your right, sorry, my left. Where it's blue is where air quality has actually improved over the last 5 years. Where you see red or yellow or especially black, that's where air quality has gotten worse. So what you see is over almost the entire length and breadth of China, air quality has improved over the last 5 years. The purpose of Greenpeace's work was to contrast that directly with India, where it's gone in the opposite direction. And if you look at the graphs, the top line is air quality in China, and the line below it is air quality in India, and you see that they cross each other last year. So that overall, nationwide, air quality in India is now worse than air quality in China for the first time ever. Also, as a note for everyone that always thinks the US does things worse, the bottom line is the US and the line above it is Europe. So actually, when it comes to air quality, we do awfully well. The Chinese efforts are not just on air quality. The 13th five-year plan has tremendous and comprehensive targets on almost every part of environmental quality, as well as on improving the energy mix and controlling climate gases. More than half the targets in the 13th five-year plan, the numeric targets, are in the energy and climate space, energy and environment space. So this is where a tremendous amount of the priorities are. And they're pretty strong on air quality, on water quality. We also have this new effort to try to address soil quality. That's much more in the experimental stage, coming up with new approaches. I also still think there's a little bit of confusion on the soil quality between sort of industrial chemical damage of soil, the Superfund site type issue, and simply agricultural overuse and salinization and the way you would address those. but there's a lot of steps towards trying to address these issues. The Chinese also have a new priority to create national parks to improve protection of protected areas. So it's really a comprehensive effort to address the environment. This is not to say that everything's perfect by any means, but I think the direction is one toward improvement, and the direction is absolutely toward taking these issues much, much more seriously than has been the case in the past. And I think what I took away from Victor's survey data is that not only are these priorities of the government, but the public is very much aware of them and takes them quite seriously. The Chinese also have ambitious international goals, and here we see the US and China increasingly working well together, right? So the Paris Agreement in December of 2015 was preceded by 2 US-China joint announcement or joint statement followed by joint announcement. I can't remember the specific label of the order, but that was November of 2014, then again in September of 2015. The latter being considered sort of a critical step on the way to actually getting agreement in Paris. It's also the case that President Xi and President Obama indicated together that they were going to work hard together on Paris. President Xi also made it clear during Paris that if his negotiators needed to clear things, he was ready by phone in the final days to get agreements on new language and that kind of thing. And some of the language from the joint statement was actually absorbed right into the Paris Agreement. So that was a tremendous sort of joint effort, and it achieved the result they wanted. And interestingly enough, that was then followed up by the joint ratification. I mean, it's all been structured so the US doesn't really have to ratify the Paris Agreement, right? Because we've already talked about how the Senate doesn't ratify treaties anymore. But our joint non-ratification happened at Hangzhou this year during the G20. And interestingly enough, I just noticed that that happened before the Germans managed to ratify it. So when the US gets to an environmental treaty before Germany does, that's pretty impressive. So the two countries are working together, and there's a lot that we both need to do. The US emissions trajectory recently has been going pretty much in the right direction. A lot of that has to do with the tremendous growth of natural gas use in the United States, although our renewable energy for electric power has also been improving. But we have a lot of specific things that we need to do to increase the trajectory downward to where it needs to go. You'll see the curve of where it is thus far doesn't really get you to our actual targets without additional work. And that's a real challenge, much of which we need to do on our own, but some of which we're actually working with China on, in particular, getting these alternatives to HFCs. So HFCs are the chemicals that we adopted to replace CFCs when we were concerned about the ozone hole, then discovered that these were incredibly bad climate gases, much worse than CO2, and we now need to figure out how to get rid of them. So that's actually one of the things that President Obama and President Xi announced that we were going to work together on in Hangzhou. But a lot of what we also need to do is in the President's Clean Power Plan, which you may realize is stuck by a Supreme Court that stayed it right. It was one of the last things that happened before Justice Scalia died, actually. And so one of the things is hopefully that comes up again in the next court session, and hopefully we have 9 members of that court. On the China side, they also have very ambitious goals to peak their carbon dioxide emissions by 2030, changing the percentage in GDP, et cetera, increasing the share of non-fossil energy, increasing forest stock. One thing when we look at China's progress over the years is that reforestation has been one of the most significant environmental measures in China. I think most people don't realize that forest cover in China in 1949 was 8.3%, or is it 8.6%? I think 8.6, and today it's about 21%. It's been a steady increase over a very, very long time, and it continues to be one of the major efforts, and the reforestation is a real contributor to reducing greenhouse gases. So there's a lot that they're doing. I think the thing that everybody knows about is the National Cap and Trade Program. That's probably only about a quarter of the total contribution to greenhouse gas control within China. Targets, quotas, efficiency standards, these kinds of things actually play a bigger role. And that is not surprising. Had the US passed Waxman-Markey, which was our last serious effort to have national legislation on greenhouse gases, 3/4 of it, even though that's always called a cap and trade bill, 3/4 of actual reductions in greenhouse gases would have come from standards and targets and things like that in our policies as well. So I think it's important to realize that China has a lot of programs, and while the cap and trade program is new and maybe challenging in the implementation, there are many other things that are much more in line with China's demonstrated policy expertise in terms of implementing targets and quotas and standards, and things that they've been doing very well for the last decade. One of the big issues is reducing coal use, obviously. China has a coal cap now, which is an important policy innovation, and they're reducing the percentage of coal in the power sector. One of the most recent things that's going on now is really talking about limiting the increase in new coal-fired power plants. There's already a moratorium on new approvals, and the real debate right now is whether all of the plants already approved are actually going to be allowed to be built and completed. And the changes in the economy, not just the slowing down, but the shift to the service sector are all of genuine benefit in terms of reducing climate gases. So one of the things I think that's important now is that for both countries right now, the emissions trajectory actually looks pretty good. The US has been shifting away from coal for quite a while. China is now also in a place where it really doesn't need that much more in terms of coal-fired power additions to their fleet. But, you know, over time, political will is going to become an issue. And I think one of the things when I talk about it becoming more of a two-way street is if you look at what the administration has argued over, especially over the last year or two, they point specifically to the China cap and trade program to say, look, we need one in the United States. So when we talk about pressure, some of the pressure is now going in the other direction, that China now has this demonstrated program that it has ramped up pretty rapidly, and the United States has this clean power program that should be the center of our climate change controls that actually has gotten stuck in the courts, and we really need to get a move on it. And in fact, I think cooperation from China in some sense today is an impetus for US action rather than the other way around. And the US desire to ensure that China continues to move with its commitments is in many ways a good nudge to the administration, which wants to be doing things but also has lots of other priorities and is dealing with lots of opposition to keep focused on it. For us, obviously, this next election is going to be critical. Who's in the Supreme Court is going to be absolutely critical to getting the plans and programs that we actually do have to implement actually moving. But I think while technical assistance continues to be important for China, and the Chinese are dealing with a number of technical problems in getting all of this renewable energy that they built well integrated into the grid, and expertise from the United States, from Germany, from other places is going to be part of solving some of these technical problems. China is increasingly also an important place where the technical solutions of tomorrow are being figured out, that the large-scale deployments that we see in China of new nuclear fleet, of third-generation nuclear power plants, of these huge wind and solar farms mean that figuring out how these things work and figuring out the challenges is very much going to happen in China. So the technical expertise is going to come as much from China as it comes from sort of traditional developed countries. And so I think we finally are at a point where this environmental relationship is very much one of mutual benefit. And this is just, so this is the U.S. Emissions trajectory right now, where you can see it's going down. And just one last graph, and then I'm going to close. This is the shift in China. So you can see that the increases sort of at the bottom, you can see, are in the non-coal-fired powered part of the fleet. So that's good news, and hopefully it will continue. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks.